Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and in this episode, we're talking about climate doom. Now, I want to start off this episode by talking about something that happened to me recently before I kick it over to my guests. I was talking with a friend from Savannah, Georgia, and I'm originally from Georgia, and so I have a bunch of friends down there, even though I live in New York now. And just in the course of kind of catching up with this old acquaintance from college days who lives in Savannah now and has for many years, I was asking them, are they going to be buying property down there? Are they going to be moving into a bigger place as they start to build a family? And they were mentioning that they were actually looking at leaving Savannah. And I thought, why? You guys love Savannah. And they were like, oh, yeah, we love Savannah. I'm just not sure it will be here in 15 to 20 years. Climate change. And that just struck me as so odd, such an incredibly weird thing to say, that Savannah won't exist in 15 to 20 years as a major city of however many people it is, several 100,000 people. And yeah, it's a coastal city, but to think that it won't exist, that's just not factually true in any sense. There's no scenario in which Savannah won't exist, even if it gets hit by a hurricane or whatever. And so it made me think about something that people are talking about more and more, which is this phenomenon of, I'm going to call it climate doom. It's when young people, especially, it could be anybody, but you see it most among young people, are convinced that climate change is much worse than potentially it really is, and can potentially convince the world is ending sometimes. And that's what I want to talk about today. Why is that happening, and what can we do about it? I want to welcome my guests, Alex Trembath from the Breakthrough Institute and Jessica Weinkle, Associate Professor at UNC Wilmington. Jessica and Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us here.
Glad to be here.
All right, so I guess this is something, both of you guys have written about this in the past, this kind of climate doom phenomenon where people think that climate change is much worse than it is. Yeah, I don't know when we can trace this back to, but when did you first see this starting to become like a feature of the discourse around climate change?
One of the frustrating things about climate doom, as we're talking about here, is that it's kind of a moving target. So to literally answer your question, Jeremiah, the first time that I really sort of saw and grappled with climate doom was around 2007, 2008. We've had these fears of the apocalypse for a long time, sort of the bulk of millennials' lifetimes at this point. And the line then in Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, which came out in 2006, was that we had 10 years to solve the climate crisis. Obviously, it has been almost 20 years since then. We have not solved the climate crisis, but nor have we reached some incontrovertible cataclysmic climate tipping point. And what really forced me, and I've told this story before, but what really forced me to sort of reckon with the, I think, quite toxic doom out there in climate science, climate politics, culture, was my sort of reaction to Hurricane Katrina. And I viscerally remember thinking, I can't wait for another Hurricane Katrina because then those climate deniers will get what's coming to them. And I thought that, and then I immediately was kind of disgusted with myself, because I think that's where climate doom leads you, is to these incredibly sort of anti-humanist desires and sort of inclinations about the world. So all of that is to say that I think climate doom has been with us a long time. I'm sure we'll talk in this conversation about its many sort of instantiations and how it's kind of a moving target. But that's when I first sort of discovered it and really was kind of forced to reckon with it.
Yeah, so for me, I think something similar around Hurricane Katrina. So I grew up in Miami, Florida. My dad in Miami Beach, and my dad grew up in Miami Beach too. And I grew up listening to his stories about preparing for hurricanes, and they were more of it was like a cultural phenomenon, right? So the mascot at my high school were the high tides. It was just accepted the areas hit by hurricanes, and this is how you prepare for them, and that was that. And then with Hurricane Katrina and I'm kind of running over the whole story about Hurricane Andrew, but the doomism with Hurricane Katrina, I was doing an internship at the Rosenstiel Institute at the University of Miami, and the discussion around the halls and the sciences at that time was, well, Hurricane Katrina it's not really about climate change, but if we just let people think it's about climate change, then it will, move the needle for action on climate change mitigation. And I'm like, that is very not appropriate for, we're not supposed to misrepresent the science in that way. And then at some point, a very, I think, smart person was talking to me about climate change as a social construct, and society kind of creates all these different ideas around it, about what it really means and what it is, and that was, to me, the introduction to the doomism and the stories that we tell ourselves about what's going on in the world and sort of how it relates to the human condition and our understanding of ourselves on the planet over time.
Yeah, when I think about this, I think about Greta Thunberg, and I think climate doomism has been around longer than Greta Thunberg. But she, to me, represents a turning point where it almost became very mainstream to be the mainstream, is certainly in progressive circles. The mainstream point of view is that doom is coming. And I think about that speech that she gave where she, the how dare you speech, and she's fired up and she's screaming at these people at the United Nations. And she's saying, I remember this line, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood." And even at the time, I remember thinking first of all, you're Norwegian. If there is anyone in the world who is going to be fine from climate change, it's the Norwegians. Your childhood, I promise you, Greta, will be fine. You're going to be fine. If someone has stolen your childhood, I not to be mean to a 12-year-old, which is what she was at the time or whatever. But if someone stole your childhood, that's a you problem to some extent. And so now that I've insulted a 12-year-old, I do think for me that seemed like a rhetorical shift right there. But we've kind of reached this point where it's almost accepted that, yeah, doom is coming. And Alex, you talked about kind of this timeline, 10 years to fix the problem, which obviously we've passed that at this point. I want to go back, though, to something that that Jessica mentioned, which is natural disasters. And both of you guys mentioned them a little bit. But one of the things people will do is they will point at natural disasters, whether it's fires in the Western United States, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, and they'll say, look, all of this is an example of climate change, and it's only going to get worse. And I think we have to start with just a factual description. Number one, what is happening with climate change? Is it causing specific things to happen? Is it causing natural disasters to happen? What is the actual state of what climate change is doing to the world, right now?
Yeah, so, climate change is primarily caused by, extra anthropogenic human-caused carbon emissions in the atmosphere that adds more heat and energy to the atmosphere, which just mechanically does affect all of weather, and including extreme weather and what we call natural disasters, which is really just when weather extremes interact with human society. So at the centuries plural timeline, climate change will affect all of weather, will have some impact on all extreme weather. In 2023, the sort of anthropogenic climate impacts that we can detect over the long term in regards to extreme weather are mostly in the form of higher temperatures, heat waves, sort of more precipitation. Again, there's more energy in the atmosphere, so more precipitation in some geographies, and a couple other things. You mentioned fires, Jeremiah. So the global land area burning has actually decreased over the last several decades, but climate change, higher temperatures have increased sort of mega fire risk in places like the American West. So you actually do see sort of more and bigger mega fires in the U.S., in the West, in sort of the Western United States, for instance, although there are a whole bunch of other factors driving that as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that land management practice?
Yeah.
Partially the mega fire part?
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll get to that as well. All of these extreme weather natural disasters are a combination of the weather and the geography and the infrastructure that it's hitting. So like an earthquake that hits Haiti is much more destructive than an earthquake that hits Japan. There's no climate signal in either of those things, obviously, because earthquakes have nothing to do with carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And so we should be remembering that as well when we talk about fires, when we talk about hurricanes, when we talk about tornadoes. At the sort of aggregate sweep, though, the sort of trends in hurricanes, droughts, floods, tornadoes globally is pretty flat over the last few decades. The cost of natural disasters is going up, but that's mostly due to the fact that there's more societal wealth, quote unquote, in harm's way. So, a hurricane that hits Miami today might in fact, and in fact does kill fewer people and harm fewer people, but it causes more economic destruction because there's a lot more infrastructure and buildings and wealth in the waterfront. That's sort of the long and the short of it when it comes to climate change and natural disasters, if I'm not mistaken about that, Jessica.
No, I would agree. It's more people, more wealth being more stuff in harm's way. And so when we do have these societal interactions with extreme events, extreme weather events, it gets expensive.
This is particularly interesting to me because until I started researching this episode, I did not realize that this narrative that exists about climate change is causing more extreme droughts and floods and hurricanes, that effectively it doesn't seem to be true. That, as you said, Alex, the number of hurricanes, the severity of hurricanes is mostly just flat on a decades-long timescale. And that's true for most things other than, obviously the temperature is going up. And so we're getting more heat waves. That seems to be true. But there's this very, very strong narrative that actually, no, every time there's a drought or a flood or a hurricane, that it's part of climate change. And I was surprised to learn that kind of the countervailing narrative that you're putting out here. And I consider myself like a well-educated policy guy whose job it is to know a bunch of facts about a whole bunch of stuff. And that still caught me off guard. And I really think it's a really dominant narrative that climate change is causing all of these floods and droughts and tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that.
Yeah, and part of it is a sort of banal ignorance like your own there, Jeremiah. I think a lot of people, including it sounds like your friend in Savannah and lots of people in my social circle, just get this sense from the elite media, from climate activists, that and from this sort of relentless and very sort of stilted coverage of extreme weather in sort of mainstream news, that these natural disasters are increasing and that climate change is the main factor driving the increase, when neither of those things is true. So I think a lot of it is just a sort of innocent naivete, sort of accepting the dominant narrative about climate change coming from mainstream media. Some of it is more sort of intentionally manipulative, as Jessica was talking about earlier. You'll meet people who actively sort of understand the science of climate change, the empirics on extreme weather and natural disasters, but want to use the latest megastorm as a sort of a token or as a symbol in recruiting climate activism. So like hurricane example was the prototype. Hurricane Katrina was the prototypical example 15 or so years ago. But now every single named storm and every single sort of natural disaster caught on film is another reason for climate advocates and climate journalists to sound the alarm about the risks of climate change and the need to sort of upend our lives and upend all of modern society to reduce these risks, when in fact most of what we're talking about is the natural hostility of the world's climate to human societies. These types of hostile weather have been with us since before our species existed. They have gotten sort of worse in some cases, and we are more and less adapted to them, depending on especially the wealth of a civilization, but also sort of hard and soft infrastructure. But there is an attempt, I think, to sort of deliberately manipulate the news coverage, the sort of activist messaging and narratives around extreme weather. And then a third factor is this new sort of scientization of natural disaster event attribution. So the sort of typical and the dominant way to attribute a natural disaster or a trend in natural disasters to anthropogenic global warming, to human-caused emissions warming the atmosphere, is to observe the number and intensity of, for instance, hurricanes over the multi-decadal time scale. And in the last 10 years, there's this new innovation in how we are attributing natural disasters to climate change, and it's called single event attribution, where you sort of try and identify how much more likely a given storm is compared to some kind of unfalsifiable counterfactual, and then describing that natural disaster as X% more likely due to climate change. It's not, entirely wrong exactly, but it does, I think, deliberately exaggerate the impact of climate change in producing this extreme weather.
Jessica, I'd love to get your thoughts on one of the ideas there, which is that, some of this is just people buying into a narrative unconsciously, and it's almost just naivete. And some of it is more deliberate, like, well, we know this might not exactly be because of climate change precisely, but it's useful, so we're going to frame it that way. Which of those do you think is kind of the stronger factor in kind of this, everything that's happening is due to climate change?
I think that there is some naivete in places. I can think of one place in particular. But a lot of it is in support of specific agendas or aligning with groups of some kind, where it's aligning with an agenda that sees climate change advocacy as a central way to mobilize people to polls, I think. And I think it is also serves as, because of the imagery involved, because of the sort of outlandish claims that can be made, it serves as a way to rope people into reading certain articles. There was an article, I thought it was interesting. There was an article at the end of September in the New York Times. It was talking about why New York floods as much as it does. And the article was ultimately about infrastructure and the need to, and it's just old infrastructure that needs redoing. But they had smattered climate change throughout this article to a point where it was really somewhat difficult to tell what the article was about.
I think that this narrative of doom exists, and it's been getting more and more popular over the years. And the one kind of counter argument that I can hear somebody making in my head as I think, okay, well, people are dooming out about this. How do we stop them from dooming? But I can hear someone saying, well, what if they're right? Not about the science, because again, we're not all going to be dead in 15 to 20 years. There was some crazy poll, and I'm gonna get the details of this wrong, so forgive me that the numbers are not exactly correct, but in spirit, this is correct. There was some poll of like millennials and Gen Z where like 30% of them thought that they might die in the next 20 years from climate change. It's some insane number, and I've got the exact number wrong, but like that's obviously like a crazy number. And so we've got this situation going on, but I can hear someone saying, well, what if they're right that it is useful? They're not right that we're all going to die, but they're right that this is a good way to get people motivated to address climate change. Because after all, climate change is a real problem. It's not a kill us all in the next 10 years problem, but it's a real problem. We're going to have to deal with this. Society needs to do some stuff. And what if they're right that this is a good way to light a fire under people? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it happens at least at two levels, Jeremiah, as you're saying. So first, it's precautionary principle. It's, well, maybe the risks won't be quite as bad as our most dire scenarios are suggesting, or maybe emissions won't get that high, maybe warming won't get that high. But there might be sort of unforeseen tipping points or sort of uncertain risk or dragons that come out of the sky after 1.5 degrees of warming or something like that. And
Dragons. This is what Game of Thrones now.
I mean, like that's as sort of powerful a metaphor as any of these, or as sort of like reliable a descriptor of these unforeseen climate risks as any. Like if you actually look at the climate science literature on tipping points, on carbon cycle feedbacks, these risks are mostly not sort of threshold based. They're linear. You know, more warming is worse than less. Less warming's better than more. But mostly we're not talking about sort of unforeseen risks beyond the horizon or tipping points or sort of irreversible cataclysm. So there is this sort of precautionary approach to climate risk that I think is just not rooted in the science. And so the first thing that I always say is that they're anti or ascientific arguments. And I will continue to call out anti-scientific arguments, at least until the science changes. And I, I have often been accused of not being a sort of good member of the team for doing that. And I just have to own that at this point. For one, refuse to assimilate myself to a sort of narrativization of climate risk that is sort of decoupled from the science itself. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I'm glad you brought it, Greta Thunberg, Jeremiah, because Greta Thunberg is the sort of prototype of the young person who hears this precautionary narrative about climate risk, that these natural disasters are only going to get worse and your future is being stolen from you, and sort of millennials and zoomers actually do not have a future unless we radically reorient society and upend modern civilization. These like 12 and 14 and 16-year-old kids hear this in the same way that you do, Jeremiah, in the same way that your friend from Savannah does, in the same way that I did when I was learning about Hurricane Katrina, in my earlier years. And then what the climate communicators do with that climate anxiety that is being expressed by youth is tell them, you're right. Your fears about the apocalypse are correct. You are right to be afraid, and you should join us for the sort of ideological agenda that Jessica's talking about. And we can talk more about what that agenda is and sort of where it comes from. But that's the sort of two-step, at least, that happens here.
Well, yeah, but I guess my question, and you kind of got at this, but not really, and so maybe I'll toss it to Jessica, is, is it working? If it's cynical, because this sort of cynical thing happens in politics all the time, where, an economist might know that the policy they're promoting isn't really about jobs. It's about marginal efficiency of the tax code or whatever. But they know that the best way to promote it to the public is to say it'll bring jobs to America. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And the polling is very clear that everyone loves the jobs word way more than they care about efficiency of the tax code. So, sometimes in politics, we tolerate these white lies. And if they work, if they're good and they produce a good outcome. And my question is, do you think this is actually working? Do you think this is a productive way to get young people to care about the climate?
I don't think that scare tactics and propaganda targeted at children is ever very good. And it's not necessarily only targeted at children, but there's a fair amount of it that is. And I don't know what it might just be imagery. I'm not quite sure what gets a child interested in climate change versus the tax code. Might be just like they experience the weather and climate and they don't necessarily experience taxes quite yet. But it's not in the same way that we try not to glorify war for children. Why would we represent an important issue like climate change so dramatically poorly for them just to get them interested in it? I don't think that's appropriate. The nuance is the science is deeply nuanced. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their recent scientific assessment of climate change is 2,400 pages long. It's 2,400 pages long of nuance and detail and very carefully worded sentences. It is a lesson in grammar and punctuation, because where those sentences end and where a new one begins matters for what's being stated and what sort of claims are being made. And that does not come across in the larger narrative and what's in the media and what we tell children or anybody else. And children in particular, and I have a young child, which is perhaps why I've developed interest in this lately, but they don't have the context to pull apart political narrative and why people say things that they do. So like what you were saying about why something might be politically expedient. And so maybe they know it's not really about jobs, but they get people onto it. Children can't pull that apart quite yet. And even young adults are just learning how to.
Yeah, and I mean, the political incentives here are important to talk about because, and this is a universal feature of politics, that you're never really punished for going too hard, for exaggerating a little bit in service of the cause. Politics is not set up to ever punish anyone for doing that. And it's like whether something is accurate or not, just functionally, you are never, ever punished for being too much of a good fighter for the correct team. People will always forgive you your indiscretions, if you go overboard. And it's kind of like this asymmetric thing where, if you don't go hard enough, your own team's going to get mad at you. If you go too hard, well, they just care a lot. And maybe that's part of what's happening here.
I think that's largely true, Jeremiah, for foundation funded or grassroots funded activism, where, in the climate left, sort of no enemies to my left, that, like you can say the climate apocalypse is already here. And if you say something less radical than that, then you're not on the right team. A couple pieces of pushback to that, though. So to both of your last questions, Jeremiah, my answer is no, it's not working. Despite increasingly heated and radical rhetoric and organizing and activism about the climate apocalypse, climate change as an issue priority still ranks in the bottom third of issues that voters care about across surveys over the last decade plus. That's still true. I think you're right that you can never really be too radical or too strong in your positioning or in your rhetoric as a sort of activist or climate communicator for the activist community. But you can be unsuccessful in politics. And, it's hard to tease apart everything, but I think there is a pretty clear backlash to the climate politics of the early Obama years. The cap and trade bill was a big source of negative political advertisement from Republicans especially, but also from moderates like Joe Manchin. And then the last thing I would say is that I do think we're starting to see backlash, not just from Republicans and moderate Democrats, but we're starting to see it from the climate community itself. So in the last couple of years, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, we've started to see these sort of particularly obnoxious forms of climate activism where people are like smearing paint in museums, and they're stopping traffic, and they're doing increasingly ostentatious demonstrations.
Super gluing themselves to the floor in an NBA game,
Exactly.
And, all kinds. It's basically stunts and
just to wrap up real quick, a major funder of Extinction Rebellion, which is one of the groups that are actually performing these big demonstrations, recently announced that he respected everything Extinction Rebellion has done so far, but that they needed to change course because it's clear that these stunts are not changing anyone's minds. So I don't think that it's working empirically, and I actually think that there are forms of backlash, both from sort of wider society and sort of non-activists, but from within activism too.
And just the name of that group, by the way, Extinction Rebellion, like the idea that humans are going to go extinct is just, it strikes me as pretty absurd unless we get some apocalyptic level climate change scenario that is not the path we're on right now. It strikes me, just one more thought before we move on, that in the politics of this, I think the climate movement has almost suffered from not having a good opposition, because at the very beginning of like climate change, the climate change opposition was essentially people who said climate change isn't real. Climate change is fake. It's a liberal conspiracy. Weather changes, get over it, libs, kind of stuff. And so they never really had to like be at the top of their game. They just, to be a good climate activist, all you really had to do was say climate change is real and we needed to do something about it. And so that puts you on the right side of the argument. And when your opponent is just saying this is all fake, it seems to me like they didn't really have to develop a really strong rhetorical argumentative presence. But to move past that, because there's some other stuff that I want to talk about here, and that is, if this isn't working, what are the costs? Because I'm used to looking at things in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, and we've been talking about, does this have any benefit? Is there any benefit to presenting the information this way? Can we trick people into caring about climate change? You guys seem to think the answer is no. This is not a very good way to trick people into caring about climate change. But other than the benefit, what are the costs here? And, I think 1 or 2 days before we actually recorded this, there was an interesting article in New York Mag, or the New York Times Magazine, called "Climate Change is Keeping Therapists Up at Night." And it talks about how anxiety about the planet's future is transforming the practice of psychotherapy. And it's this entire long article about how people are like swamping their therapists with climate anxiety. And if we're being very honest, the kind of people who talk to the New York Times about their therapy sessions are all upper middle class people. They are all white class professionals with master's degrees who are in therapy almost as a form of like, recreational spending. And like, these are not the people who I think about when I think about like who climate change is going to harm. I think about climate change harms in terms of like heat waves in India and Egypt and like the developing world where it could really actually kill a bunch of people. I don't think about like somebody who lives in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and, it works at a nonprofit, that person's life is going to be ruined by climate change. But while it's not actually ruining their lives in the material sense, it does seem to be like actually impacting their mental health. And I don't know, it's fascinating to me that we've almost psyched ourselves into like this space where climate change doomism is actually harming a particular generation of people.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that climate doomism or climate catastrophism are the leading cause of increased rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidality in youth, for instance, which are up in the United States and in the Western world. It's something we should be concerned about, are these declining indicators in mental health in kids these days. But I would say that the sort of climate organizing and climate communications and climate advocacy community sees anxiety in kids as an opportunity. I think that's exactly what we saw with Greta Thunberg, who went to her parents and then went to her principal at her school to organize a climate strike and said that I'm afraid that the apocalypse is coming. And the climate activist and professional and scholarly community overwhelmingly sort of lifted Ms. Thunberg up as a sort of mascot of the appropriate way to feel and care about climate change, which is to say anxious and depressed. And I would find that pretty gross if the science of climate change actually were as dire as the sort of most heated rhetoric would suggest. And the fact that the community is both exaggerating the risks of climate change and sort of validating, as the terminology would go, the climate anxiety that generates in kids is, I think, pretty unforgivable.
I agree that I agree with Alex in that the overall indicators of mental health in children and young people being down are seriously problematic, and we should be paying attention to that. And to the extent that that can be attributed to this discourse about doom that is a wildly poor interpretation of the science is problematic. Like, so basically our politics is making children sick or unwell. And that is something that we should be concerned about. What we're doing politically with the media is problematic for our well-being. But this larger issue of that article in the New York Times is a reflection of a recent report that is in conjunction between the American Psychological Association and Eco America. And so you have an advocacy group joining up with a professional science organization promoting this frame of climate anxiety. And it's not that it's not real, right? So we're spending this whole time discussing how people understand this narrative, and children are part of that, understanding that narrative. But it also continues on with a very poor understanding of science. And based on that poor understanding of science, they're telling their patients, that the therapists are telling their patients that they're absolutely correct in feeling this way, that this is in fact what is going on in the world, that the climate change is making things so much worse. And in order to help yourself feel better, you should become politically active. And I think that is seriously problematic in so many different ways, because it conflates a lot of different issues between getting involved in politics in a medical environment, which is what Eco America has been advocating for, is basically politicization of the healthcare system, and just a poor representation of climate change knowledge.
And I mean, can I ask a follow-up question here?
Yeah.
Because most of the children that we're talking about are like children in the Western world, is who most of this research is being done about, and who are the big examples of climate eco-anxiety and things like that. And my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that most people in the Western world will be reasonably well insulated from climate change harms over the next few decades, just by virtue of like latitude where they're at, and also the fact that the Western world is much richer and can pay to mitigate a lot of stuff. And that, you know, to the extent that climate change is a very real problem, the burden will mostly fall on the developing world and on like equatorial countries that are very, very hot. And like it's almost like the anxiety's in the wrong place.
I mean, it's almost a form of stolen valor, right? When we talk about climate anxiety as a category worthy of sort of study and discussion in psychology and in the discourse, there's this sort of intentional conflation of at least a couple different things. One is, if your house burned down in a wildfire, that is materially and bodily traumatic to you. That is different from the type of anxiety that Greta Thunberg was most sincerely feeling, as far as I know, which is a sort of more ambient fear of a sort of generalized, globalized apocalypse that is coming for rich and poor, and for vulnerable and invulnerable alike. And I feel like we use the people whose lives are quite literally upended by hurricanes and fires and floods as sort of instrumental sort of mascots for this different kind of climate anxiety that is, as I think Jessica is very rightly getting at, is constructed in order to advance a type of sort of, I would say sort of radical politics that wants to use climate change, climate risk as a motivating force to drive the types of technological, infrastructural, and social change that they see necessary in the world. And again, that would be a problem for me, even if the science were as dire as they suggest it is. But it also just seems deeply unnecessary to me. What do these therapists tell their patients about how to deal with their climate anxiety? They say, like, go do climate action, go help solve the problem, go help address it. Your anxiety is correct, and here's how to channel it. The problem is apocalyptic, and here's what to do about it. But what to do about it is, like, go install clean energy, go like help restore wetlands in the ecosystem in your coastal town. Go found a startup, go like start an urban garden. These are all things that are worth doing in their own right, completely disconnected from any faux scientific climate apocalypse. So it just seems both unnecessary and costly to me.
So I think we're at the point in the conversation where I kind of turn towards solutions and solutionism and figuring out, well, if this is a problem, what do we actually do about it? If this narrative is being fed to kids, and I guess to everyone, to academics and adults and everyone, but especially to kids, it seems like have picked up this language about climate doom, and they're absorbing this narrative. What sort of counter narrative should we be promoting? How can we fight the idea that we're all going to be dead from climate change in 20 years? What is the appropriate message to be sending, and what should we be saying about climate change?
In my perspective, what has happened is that climate change has been used as an umbrella, and it has just come in and swallowed every issue that we have, from inequities to disasters to international conflict, and you name it, and there's somebody has named some climate change component to it. And these issues are important, whatever they are, and can stand alone in their importance by themselves. And so the narrative should be more focused on the particular issues. When the science community has to really clean up its act, there are so many problems with underlying assumptions in their emissions they use to project climate change, in the way that they're presenting information to the public, in the stuff that Alex was talking about the attribution science. If they are able to increase integrity and improve the integrity of their practices within the community, and I believe that improving conflicts of interest disclosures would be a big deal and go a long way in helping to improve what goes on in the climate change research community. But if they can clean up their act, a lot of the other discourse around climate change will also improve, because you cannot, the actual knowledge that they have does not support the doom that we're producing in our public discourse. It's serious. Climate change is real, and we should be concerned about it. But there's a lot of space there to have a far more productive discussion about issues and options than we have right now.
Yeah, as Jessica and I both said a couple times in this conversation, first and foremost, accurately communicate the science of climate change. That is not happening right now, as we've talked about this whole conversation. So I think that's the sort of table stakes for how to talk about the problem. But beyond that, in terms of how to sort of contextualize climate change in sort of global society, how to think about the risks of climate change, here's how I think about it. We're recording this as Israel and Palestine are at war, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues apace. And learning loss among students coming out of COVID is still really worrying. And energy and food prices are sort of spiking around the world, and on and on and on and on. There are lots of problems in the world that are worth, as Jessica's saying, being concerned about. And climate change is one of them. And if you are particularly interested in it, like I am, then by all means, go work at a think tank, found a company, become an organizer. There's lots of good work that you can do to help address the climate problem. But there's also lots of good work that you can do to help address learning loss, or sort of improve educational outcomes, or to sort of expand the welfare state, or to help solve global conflict, and to deal with those other problems. And where I get pretty nervous is when the sort of climate activist community says over and over again, this is the most important challenge human society has ever faced. I find that actually pretty disrespectful to the folks working on other problems that are not directly or even sort of tangentially related to the problem of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And I think it contributes to this sort of Manichaean, sort of apocalyptic understanding of climate change, that it's not really worth caring about other problems other relationships in the world if we don't solve this climate problem. And I just don't think that's the case. I think that, I think Jessica nailed it. It's a problem worth being concerned about. If you're particularly interested in it, like we all are, then it's something that you might even want to dedicate your career to, like Jessica and I have. But it's not totalizing, and it does not sort of obviate or overwhelm all of the problems in the world.
I would love to just see a kind of a messaging that focuses on like, we can fix this. Because so much of it seems so doom oriented that we're all going to die unless we do some, incredibly drastic that we degrowth, or we shut down every oil refinery in the world in the next 5 years, or we adopt full socialism, or whatever the case may be. I would like to see something that's just a more realistic thing that says, look, we can fix climate change. Here's a couple things we've got to realistically do, but like this is doable, and the weather will increase some, the temperature will go up, but it won't be catastrophic as it could be. Something like that would be very appealing to me. But, I always go back to, I don't know, I feel like the political dynamics here make it really hard to give a measured kind of approach to this. If you give a measured approach where you say climate change is bad, it's a problem we need to fix, but also don't panic. We can fix it and it'll be fine, probably. Like the audience for that, at least in activist world and political world, is smaller, I think, than the audience for the doom narrative. And I think that's where a lot of this dynamic comes from.
No, I've been called a climate denier for voicing that very view, Jeremiah. I mean, obviously no one here would align their worldview with that of outright scientific climate denial. But, just in the last decade, Barack Obama was described as a climate denier for not canceling the Keystone Pipeline. James Hansen, the sort of godfather of modern climate science, was called a climate denier for endorsing the use of nuclear power to lower emissions. The sort of groups that are advancing this sort of catastrophist understanding of climate risk are not actually interested in incrementally addressing or fixing the problem. That's why they have advanced the sort of imagery and understanding of the climate apocalypse from the future to the present. And you can actually see it in the documents that they write about single event attribution and about things like the Exxon new climate activism campaign. They say that we need to go beyond the sort of mainstream understanding of mainstream understanding of climate science to increase the salience of the apocalypse in people's minds so that they support this radical agenda that they're clearly not supporting yet. Must be because they don't feel nearly as afraid as they should yet. Yeah.
This reminds me of there's a metaphor in an old Slate Star Codex article talking about veganism, where, PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, is an organization that's well known for doing all these ridiculous stunts. They'll throw red blood, like animal blood or red paint or something, on anybody who's wearing fur. And I remember one time they offered to pay for people's water bills in Detroit when it was like a big issue, but only if the people went vegan. And that made a bunch of people really, really mad. And the thing about that is, like, PETA is very like extreme and they're kind of assholes, but you hear about them. They get in the news. And, there's other groups like Vegan Outreach, which, nobody on this call or listening to this has ever heard of. And Vegan Outreach is a very nice little nonprofit that does a lot of very nice vegan things and is very cool and is not controversial, and nobody's ever heard of them. And I think that dynamic kind of exists with like Extinction Rebellion and some of these groups, Sunrise Movement, that the more extreme you are, the more attention you get. And that leads into its own vicious cycle. So I don't know. It's a whole dynamic.
It is. And I mean, I would just note that the rate of veganism has actually declined over the last 20 years, just like the sort of express priority that voters in the United States and in other developed countries place on climate change has remained sort of pretty underwhelming. So something about these attention-getting stunts and styles of organizing is not working.
So I will say that I'm very sympathetic to the animal rights cause, but I have had various interesting interactions with vegans over the years. So I'll just leave that. I'm dealing with one right now anyways, I'm dealing with one right now. But I am convinced that the apocalyptic climate change narrative is in itself a business. And it has connection. There's a good and growing bulk of literature about in the financial world about the connections between media and investment practices, and ideas for how to use the media as a proxy of climate change risk and then hedge your investments and all kinds of other stuff. And so it's not just about the public perception. I mean, it is about the public perception, but in part because it's driving financial activities. And so the two have become very tightly entwined between what is done in climate science, who's involved with developing the scenarios that we use to create climate change projections, and their relationship to the financial industry, and then what goes on in the media, and that relationship to the financial industry. It's quite the tangled web.
All right, so we are coming up on time now. I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we've been talking about, in I guess the climate movement as a whole, but I'll say particularly about climate anxiety, climate doom, kind of a realistic view of what's happening with the climate versus the kind of the exaggerated version. I don't know. Where would you recommend for people to go to learn more? This could be books, blogs to read, people to follow on social media, anything that you think would be helpful.
Mike Hulme has a new book called Climate Change Isn't Everything. It's short, it's succinct. I think it does a great job of covering the science as well as the sort of social construction of climate risk, as much better than I've ever done. So I'd recommend that book. In case Jessica ends up being too humble to recommend her own Substack, it's called Conflicted. I would recommend that. It's fantastic. And then I'd also recommend Roger Pilkey Jr.'s Substack. It's called The Honest Broker. And he is sort of, one of the most outspoken scholars on the sort of both the sort of climate science and again on the sort of social construction of climate risk out there in the world today.
I agree with Alex, both of those sources, and not to scratch each other's back, but the Breakthrough Institute has some really great essays about how to understand specific issues that have come up in the discourse about climate change and how to better understand it and the nuance underneath it.
Well, I hope people can get a lot out of those sources, whether it's Jessica's blog, the Breakthrough blog, the other sources that were listed. I hope that we all here on this podcast will survive the next 10 years and that climate change doesn't kill us all. Man, will we look dumb if we're all dead in 10 years. But but I don't think that will happen. And so I do want to say thank you one more time to my guests, Jessica Weinkle and Alex Trembath. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having us here.
Jeremiah, thanks for having us. Great to talk to you, Jessica.
Yeah, it was good to talk to you guys both.